Welcome, everybody, to week 9. That means after this week, we're halfway through the semester, hard to believe. And I have returned. I'll make a couple of announcements. For today's topic, I think will be very interesting to just about everybody who's attending and or watches it later on YouTube. Art of the Americas, by which we mean North and South America, but it will primarily focus on North America. And those would be the indigenous cultures. Obviously, some of you know that today at the main campus of the JC, there's an Indigenous Peoples Day celebration or ceremony, and I've been seeing the notifications of it. Not being there and living in Berkeley, at some point, if any of you attended and you wanted to get back to us with some feedback from it. I remember the time frame. I think it was earlier today, but in any case, I read their schedule of events, and it sounds really interesting. And of course, the subject we're covering today overlaps directly with that because we're going to cover the used to be called pre-Columbian cultures, but that's not usually the term anymore. Let me go ahead and do the speaker view here. Let's see if we got, yeah, we do. Admit, there we go. Welcome, Justine. We just got started. I was just making a couple announcements. First, I will just say today's topic again is going to cover the Mesoamerica, is what it's usually called, or Central American cultures from the last several hundred years of their, dominance, and that, of course, will include the Aztecs, but also some of the other cultures in that part of North America. A lot of people, I think, forget that geography is one of the least understood subjects in American or poorly taught subjects. In Europe, you can't graduate from, I think it's high school, let alone college, without passing certain basic requirements to understand world geography. Most Americans don't even know, like, for instance, Idaho is a state in the US. That's where my wife's family is from, where she was born and raised. And she used to teach in Oakland, and she would get questions like, is that part of Canada? Is that in the US? Is that a foreign country? No, it's one of the 50 US states. We're going to talk about South America briefly, but if I had more time, or we had more time, we would go into more detail. But the Incas obviously are an important culture. So we have a couple slides from that part of the world. And then the Southwest and Plains Indians as well. That'll be what we'll probably get to on Wednesday. Okay, let's do a speaker view here first. So I can tell you a couple more things that I think will be helpful for those of you who, for instance, I noticed not too many. This class has a very high proportion of people who met the deadline for their papers. And that's good news, because the few, I think it's maybe half a dozen that haven't, I'm going to give you a heads up. I'm not going to call anyone out at this point by name, but I've been told it's an acceptable thing as long as it has no bearing, and it doesn't, on that person's, grade or, level of achievement in the course. It's just a friendly reminder. On Wednesday, I probably will mention the names of those who are currently enrolled and yet haven't turned the first paper in. As a reminder, don't wait too much longer, because I've already graded all the ones I got in on time. But I will say, I think it's, let me double check. I believe 2 people, it might only have been 1 from this class, but at least 2 people had not submitted their papers. They were graded and entered in the roll book, but I couldn't email them their grade because they sent them under a different name. And I can't guess. So at this point, in other words, I didn't have their email address. I had their name, but I had to do some detective work to figure out, well, who is this? Eventually, of course, it usually was on the top of their cover sheet. But in terms of responding, I had no record of their individual email address. So if that 1 or 2, I think it's Bautron is one, and then there's one other, are people who did, that's it. Out of 30 some people that have submitted papers, that's a very high proportion. It's 90%, almost 90% of the class. That's really good. That's above average by far. But if you're one who hasn't, please try to submit them soon. Or if you're one of those 2, I think it is, that didn't get your grade back and you submit your paper on time, you need to email me at Mark W. and give me your correct current email address, and I'll be in my files from that, hopefully for that point on, and I can return your grades to you. I also have returned pretty much, well, there were a few that didn't get returned yet of midterms, but almost all the midterms. And they were also quite good. Not everybody got an A or a B, but most people did. Remember, though, if you didn't do well on either of those first two assignments, the paper, short paper, or the midterm, you can easily recover the majority, the bulk of those points. Well, hardly nobody that I know of didn't. If you submitted those, you at least got enough points that if you add, in other words, a point is mathematically add 60 points if you choose to take advantage of the maximum amount of extra credit for every student in all my classes this semester is 60 points. So even if you got like 40 or 50 on either the paper or the midterm, you can make up the lost points with extra credit, and then hopefully you'll do better on the next paper or the final exam. You have a little time, but I'm trying to give you guys who haven't, the few of you who haven't turned your papers in, a little bit of a boost or an incentive not to wait much longer, because now you've got other classes. I'm sure most of you do, right, with their deadlines, but also our second paper's not that far away. And some of you should be thinking about what you want to write about. Remember, any subject, any topic, any artist, any style, whatever work of art motivates you. It doesn't have to be from the periods we cover. Okay. Speaking of which, are there any questions about extra credit or papers or grades? Without getting, numerically specific, that's confidential as far as the grades for each individual. But any general questions about grading, extra credit, or the first or second papers? Anybody? Okay. Well, let's shift gears then to today's topic. We'll cover probably the first 5 out of the 10 slides, roughly. Well, that is half, literally, of the total for this week of, again, the way it's listed in Stockstead and in the syllabus, Art of the Americas after 1300. So happens that 1300 is around the time the Aztecs began to dominate Central America. And as some of you may know, they weren't exactly a peaceful most human cultures that achieved, some level of urban civilization weren't very peaceful in terms of their total, behavior towards all their neighbors. That's pretty much just a human fact of human history. They were pretty brutal in some cases, but they were one of the most advanced civilizations in the world, even as late as the Spanish invasion. That's obviously the 1500s under Cortez. We're going to talk about that, the very first slide, in fact, in just a couple minutes. But even that late, most historians credit Mexico City, not Tenochtitlan, I can almost say it correctly in pronunciation and the correct way of saying it in Spanish, which was the Aztec capital and is now where Mexico City is today. That city was over 500,000 people and one of the 2 or 3 largest cities in the world that far back. Remember we covered Japan last week, right? Yeah, and we talked about Japan having, with Tokyo, it was then called Edo, 250 years ago, one of the 2 largest cities in the world, along with London. Those are the only 2 cities that had over 1 million people in the late 1700s. That changed very soon after the next century. Paris and other big cities around the world started to grow more rapidly. New York, Chicago reached 1 million in the 1800s. But in the period we're covering, the 13 to the 1600s, there were very few cities in the world over 100,000, certainly not over 500,000. And one of them was the capital of the Aztecs. So we're going to start with that. Okay, if you've been to, I know from your mini bios, many of you either from that part of the world, Central America, or you've been there. My trips to Mexico, I was lucky on my first trip. I caught Montezuma's revenge from eating in a, outdoor plaza where there was, food carts and things. I just was unlucky. But all that did was delay my flight, which I then had to cancel to Cuba. I went to Cuba later on another trip. So I ended up spending 5 days because my passport went missing. It happens. It's happened in other parts of the world as well to me and a few of my other traveling friends. So you got to, replace it. It takes a while, and the U.S. Embassy is the only place to go. So I had about 5 or 6 days of unexpected extra time in Mexico City, and I really enjoyed it. And that was my first exposure to the capital of Mexico, one of the world's largest cities, 21, now it's probably 22 million people, slightly bigger than Greater New York. There aren't many cities in the world with over 20 million people. Only one in the U.S., and that's New York City, and then maybe as many as 24 around the world, mostly in China and India. Okay, but Mexico City is one of those. Okay, so we're going to get to that in a minute. If you have, and you should have your syllabi in front of you, I will, because it's such a hard word to pronounce, let alone spell. But remember the final A, it's not cumulative. Nothing we had from the midterm before is going to be on the final. And second, you have it, it's open book. So you have the chance to look up all the spellings here on the syllabus, but I will give them to you as we go. So let's get to the first slide for now to start today's topic. Okay, so here we go. Hiding this again, getting it out of the line of sight. There we go, and maximizing this image. Okay, this is a fascinating work of art, and it tells the story of a clash of two really powerful and highly developed cultures, which is exactly what happened in the what's now Mexico, Central America, between the Spanish and the Aztecs. So here we go. The title of this piece, Founding. You don't have to say the if it's on the exam. Just you could start with the word founding, right? Like it is usually spelled, of Tenochtitlan. Okay, I'll spell that long multisyllabic word. Tenochtitlan. Tenochtitlan. I was coached in that by someone from indigenous culture, who was in my classes before the shutdown in Petaluma campus. She managed with a little patience to have me practice that word before I started this same lecture in that class. Mexico, the country today is Mexico, and the date of this is 1545. Well, I don't imagine most of you have memorized, the years the Spanish invaded, but this is well after Cortez's conquest of Mexico, but it's within his lifetime and the lifetime of some of the Aztecs who survived. And yes, quite a few did that rather, tragic, you can say calamitous event for their culture, the invasion of the Aztec Empire by the Spanish under Cortez. That's what this, in essence, documents, that event, which occurred about over 20 years earlier, 1520s. It was commissioned by, some think, the governor, the then Spanish, of course, by that time, governor of Mexico. And so this would have been a way of symbolizing, you could say summarizing, but I think a better word is symbolizing the existence of that capital city, Tenochtitlan, before the Spanish arrived. And it has a kind of a minimal map-like quality, which isn't obvious when you look at it. You wouldn't think this is a map, but it is kind of a very broad overview of the city plan. How so? Does it illustrate the city layout, you can say, or plan, either word will do in your notes, of the Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan, before the Spanish conquered and, of course, destroyed it? Well, we said it was a city of about 500,000, so now you should write that if you didn't already know that, which was one of the largest cities on earth by 1500. But this depicts it when it was founded in the early around 1300. So it was over 220 years old when the Spanish invaded. So this is the symbolic, these blue lines here, let's get up close, of the canal system that crisscrossed this city. That's what was the most amazing thing. When the Spanish arrived, they honestly thought, they must be, some of them thought they were hallucinating. Well, it was a very hot, climate with no shade at this point in the area where they were. Maybe some of them thought they had heat, disease or whatever it's called, overheating, that you can get where you do hallucinate, because they couldn't believe that in the middle of what they thought, of course they did, as an inferior culture, quote unquote, which obviously it wasn't. They had these incredibly, very highly developed urban structures, or you can say infrastructure. That's the right word, right? The infrastructure included bridges, canals, large multi-story public buildings is all part of the meaning. And that's how the 500,000 people roughly that lived in what was then the capital of the Aztec Empire were able to have this high level of urban civilization. Their leaders and their, obviously their builders, right, that helped them build, their skilled laborers built this incredible city on what in essence is a giant lake. And that's why Mexico City is sinking today, because the Spanish built right on top of the ruins of the Aztec capital without thinking clearly about the risks. I don't know if any of you were, probably not, in Mexico City when it had that horrible earthquake. I remember when that happened. I was a real estate agent then, and I had friends who had family, and clients even who had family back in Mexico City. And it was 10 or 12,000 people died. That's a pretty high death toll. Could have been much worse. And parts of the city were then completely uninhabitable for, as far as I know, they might still be, but for whole sections of Mexico City, they were roped off, and the government said it's not safe because they started to sink either during or right after the earthquake. Because the city of Mexico City is built on the ruins of Tenochtitlan, the old Aztec capital. And that city was built, but more carefully, over a lake. So they channeled the water, the Aztecs figured, their engineers, how to do that, into safely, flowing, canals and reservoirs, of course, for their drinking water. So that's what this symbolizes. The outer border and the cross of the two blue lines symbolize it's just a minimal representation of the many, many canals that crisscross that city. And then there's the warriors here, who helped, of course, start that empire and then conquered almost all their neighbors. And this is an indication of their human sacrifice, which they definitely did practice. And that's a human skull, which would be after one of their captured enemies. Usually would be enemy soldiers or, people from that age, that fighting age. In other words, they didn't usually do that with children, women, and children. But yes, there were human sacrifices at sometimes, not regularly, but several times a year when they had certain religious ceremonies. So that's symbolized by this detail. And then here are the warriors in combat down here, apparently besting some inferior, enemy soldiers, right? Combatants. And then this is symbolic of their step pyramids. As you know, some of you, we're going to take a look at a couple of those today, or at least one. All right, so that's how this is. It's a large piece of heavy, it's either parchment. I think it is parchment, yeah. And it's ink and, dye of some kind on parchment. And it's in a museum. I believe it's in Mexico City, but just say it's now exhibited in a museum that covers the history of Mexico, both before and after the Spanish conquest. But the most probably important detail is this symbol. And those of you who have Mexican heritage or family and friends who do, or been there several times like I have, will know that that's the symbol that's on the flag of Mexico, right? An eagle landing on top of a cactus on top of a rock is symbolic of how the Aztecs were supposedly given a sign by their gods that this is the place to now build your capital. Supposedly right where the starting point of the construction of their capital began, was supposedly due to some sign from their gods. Remember, they believe in multiple gods. When an eagle landed on top of a cactus, which itself was growing out of a rock, and they were then supposed to start building their capital. So that's what that symbolizes. And it's now a part of that image of those three objects, the eagle, the cactus, and the rock, part of the flag of Mexico, and many other symbols that are used to symbolize Mexico, the country itself today. All right, that's plenty on the meaning here. All right, let's do a formal analysis. It is balanced, definitely, carefully. So now some people say, oh, well, look, there's 4 warriors here and only 2 here. But when you add up, the other objects in this side, I think you could say it's roughly balanced. And then, of course, 2 warriors here, 2 above and below the midline. And so it's roughly balanced. But then again, you have to take into account these figures here. So if I would draw the line right here, and I would call it roughly balanced. Certainly this whole diagram, and that's really it's more of a diagram than a map, is itself, or plan, of the city, very minimally delineating, depicting, if you want to say illustrating, the concept of the city's layout. Do you just look at that, it's balanced. I would say definitely top to bottom, left to right. If you want to get more technical, it depends on how you want to view how many objects there are above and below. But because of the eagle and the rock and the cactus, you might make the case it's weighted toward the top, but roughly balanced, definitely left to right, however you look at it. Okay, the rhythm is obvious. The warriors with their weapons, their helmets, uh, and they actually had a kind of armor. It wasn't metal armor like the Spanish, but they had a kind of a protective jackets that they wore into combat. And then, of course, the seated warriors here, and then some of the decorative plant motifs here that you see all around the seated figures. That creates very, very strong rhythm. There is similar texture, but it's mostly limited to the eagle, the cactus, and all the other. Well, these look like cacti, right? I assume they are. You can say the plants, including the large cactus and the eagle, those have similar texture, but I don't really see much similar texture on the seated warriors. There's some on the jackets of the two combating or fighting warriors down below. So there isn't a lot of similar texture, but there is some. That's fairly realistic. This is all done with thin lines, except you could make the case the outlines, it's up to you to decide, is that a thin line or a bold line? I mean, it could be either, depending how you look at it. But certainly the human figures and the plants are all depicted with thin outline. Is there any modeling? It's minimal, really only on the eagle and the cactus that the eagle's landing on. I don't see it anywhere else here. Is it stable or dynamic? Well, it's both. It's dynamic because of the canals, crisscrossing canals, and the tops, at least, of the head. Certainly the eagle is, and the cactus is dynamic. These two warriors are in motion, so they're more dynamic than the seated ones, who are mostly stable. And then the border is obviously stable around both the outer edge of the city map or diagram and then around the decorative border of the actual page. It's a page in a manuscript. I don't know if I said that. I might not have. It's a page from a manuscript that was commissioned by the governor, Spanish governor of Mexico, with indigenous artists. So I should have said that. I apologize. Who were hired to illustrate the history of their own culture. So at least that governor was, trying to show a little bit of awareness of what came before the Spanish conquest. Okay, and then let's see. We want to talk about the largest mass. Well, depends on how you break it down, but I'd say it's the eagle. Yeah, and then it's a close call between the seated warriors. The standing warriors are taller, so they would be the next largest in my view, and then the seated warriors, and then the smaller cacti. Well, actually, this cactus would come probably. It's a close call. You decide if it's bigger than the seated warriors around it, and then they would be third in that case. Okay, the color's cool, of course, and all the water depicted by the canals and the outer border as well. That's supposed to be. There was a canal around the outer edge to defend the city, and that is what for a while kept the Spanish from. They some of you have to write this. It took them two different assaults, two different times, 2 years apart, I believe it was. First time it didn't succeed when Cortez attacked. They were repulsed, whatever, rebuffed, and had to retreat. And then they spent the winter out, somewhere in the wilds of Mexico and recruited some of the tribes that had been conquered by the Aztecs and were willing to join the Spanish. Unfortunately for the Aztecs. So then they came back again the next year, and that even took months. So it wasn't like, they attacked and they took the city over in a few weeks in a single siege. It was a multi-year campaign. And so the city was defended by the outer row of canals. And so, of course, those are all, as is the outer border, cool blue. And then in here you have some neutral. It's off white now because it's faded, but that originally would have just been white, where there is no color. And then you have black horses, again neutral, on the hair of the warriors seated and standing. And here I would say it's a borderline between you could almost make the case that that's very dark brown, but it looks more black in this image at least. So that would be neutral on the eagle and cool on the largest cacti, but warm on some of the details like the shields and the faces and legs of the warriors. Okay, let's see. Are we forgetting anything? Oh, for space. Sorry, that's kind of important. Yeah, for here we have just overlapping. That's all. You can't say that there's diminishing size because these warriors are just all about the same size and they're just placed geographically around the perimeters. So there's overlapping of the eagle over the cactus and the clothing of the warriors over their bodies. That would be the only made technique for space, depicting depth of space. There is no foreshortening, diminishing size, obviously no scientific perspective or atmospheric perspective, and there's no register line here. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. Okay, now this is a diagram, or you could say, no, better word, not diagram, it's an illustration of the main temple in Mexico City. Now, I've been there, and I know some of you have. I'm pretty sure, at least some of you said you were either from that part of Mexico, either perhaps lived in Mexico City, or at least had been there. And it's an amazing site. If time permitted, I would show you my own slides. Let me see. I think I do have, you know what? No, I don't have. Yeah, not here, but maybe on if time permits on Wednesday, I might show you a few of my own slides for that. But let's just focus on the must-knows. These are from the syllabus, of course. By the way, again, I will sort of apologize. I forgot to tell you the first slide, the founding of Tenochtitlan, is a very important slide. It won't be cutting it from the study list. You remember how that works when we do the review for the final, the week before the final exam. We'll cut the list down by at least 40%, maybe more, of the total of all the listed slides since the midterm. And so I won't be cutting that first one. So if you wanted to go back and mark some whatever kind of symbol you use to indicate that that's the slide you want to make extra careful study of for the final, you should do that now. Okay, this is the second must know for today. Templo Mayor, meaning major temple. Templo, and mayor, as some of you may know, is like the English word mayor, but it means major in Spanish. Mayor, Templo Mayor, Mexico City. And it's still there, and that's what's amazing about it. But it is and it isn't. I'll explain in a minute. The date, circa, you can ignore, remember, the little C just means we don't have the exact year. 1500. Well, actually, that's misleading. So let's start with that fact. We'll start with what is it? This was the largest and most important of the Aztec temples in their capital, which was, remember, Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital. And I've been there, so I know they have a museum underneath the remains of this temple. The upper roughly third of it has been excavated, and the bottom is underground. They found it during excavation for a subway system. This is all part of the meaning. I mean, nobody knew it was still there. They thought the Spanish had totally destroyed it. They buried it, I guess, under rubble and then built on top of it. But it's been excavated. So about this part here, roughly the upper, more like a quarter of it, is above ground, and you can walk around and see. It's fascinating. The plaza and the upper row of stairs, and what's left of the two sections of the temples where the religious ceremonies, including human sacrifice. I mean, that's what you're seeing here, right? And other non-violent. I mean, most of their ceremonies were not human sacrifices, but several times a year they did have those. So that whole section is visible now. And it's right behind the main plaza, if you know, some of you in Mexico City, right? Where the cathedral is. It's right behind the cathedral, which is the oldest Christian church in, not in all of North America, that's in Cuba, but because Cuba was settled by the Spanish or conquered by the Spanish decades earlier, right, in the late 1400s. So Cuba's about the Spanish buildings and settlement and conquest, or you can just say the Spanish remnants of early Spanish occupation go back 30 years longer in Cuba. But the second oldest capital city, now this is an important fact, I think is part of the meaning of what this is, this site. The city itself now, the current city of Mexico City, is the second oldest capital city in this hemisphere. The oldest is in Cuba, and it's not Havana. Havana was built later. I mean, that is very old. It's almost 500 years old, but there was an earlier capital. You don't have to know that part, but those who care to know, it's called Santiago de Cuba, and I've been there, and it's a beautiful city, almost as beautiful as Havana. Both cities are remarkably lovely and very authentic architecture from 500 years ago. But of course, the Aztecs were around hundreds of years before that. So when was this actually built? This is the reason I said there's some misleading bit of information. I don't say Stockdead's doing that per se, but historians have two different dates they use, in other words, for this site. The founding of the temple itself and the original foundation of it, which would mean at least this part, this section here, the bottom section, in other words, the foundation and the lower level, go back to about 1300, the year that they first settled here and started building their capital. So parts of this site go to 1300, much earlier than 1500. But in 50 or by, let's say by 1500, that date isn't inaccurate because they had expanded the temple, enlarged it, made it larger, taller, and remodeled it. So it was remodeled and expanded around 1500, which is what the Spanish saw when they arrived and what they just tried to destroy. But what's left of it is the part that's from about that 1500, the upper quarter roughly. Okay, what else you can say about the meaning of this is, well, the sacrifices. Yes, they did when they captured enemy warriors. Mostly that's who they would have done that with. They believed their gods demanded human sacrifice. And they were not by any means the only culture that ever did that, or even at that time. But in Europe, the kinds of sacrifices were more religious wars, right? Catholics and Protestants. It wasn't as regular, but it happened more than every generation. There would be a purge, a massacre is a better word. Paris, 10,000 Christians, because they were Protestants, were massacred by the orders of the Catholic King of France at that time. And right around the same time, in the mid-1500s, a little later, actually, in the mid-1500s. So there were other kinds of sacrifices in other parts of the world. But it was a regular ritual of the Aztec priests that they believed they had to sacrifice, usually hundreds on any given day or during a series of days, a week, a holy week. You could use that word, or you could just say during a period of time when for several days in a row, they might have sacrificed several hundred people several times a year during certain religious celebrations, you can say, or I don't want to say holidays, but religious events. Several times a year, they would sacrifice hundreds of people, and that's what this indicates here. The blood flowing down. It's not just one person, probably several that same day. This is, of course, an artist's rendering of what it looked like when it was intact. All right, and then the only other thing to say about it, I think, as far as the meaning goes, is it was quite impressive. It was over 200 feet tall. When you get to the top of these, the two, this is a pyramid, and these are the temples. But you can just say the whole thing's a temple because the pyramid acts as the base for the two temples, inside of which the high priest, if you didn't know this, you should be writing this. These two temples, what were they used for? Well, sometimes for human sacrifices, but most of the time, you can just say in general, they were used for various religious ceremonies throughout the year by the high priests who conducted those ceremonies. And so different ceremonies were conducted in different on different days and in different of these two different temples. And that's where you can still see the remnants of those two temples now if you go to see that site in Mexico City. So that's when you add the height of this. We're going to segue now in a moment to the form analysis, but it's part of the meaning too, because it was one of the tallest pyramids at that time in the New World, nowhere near as tall as the ones in Egypt, right? Which were the tallest one in Egypt was 480 feet tall, the highest structure ever built by human beings until the Eiffel Tower. So it's not that high, but it's close to half that height. It's about 220 feet. It's a pretty good height to the top of the tallest of the two temples. That's like a 22-story skyscraper would be today. Pretty impressive, obviously. And so, again, with Mexico, I didn't say this earlier, but it fits now on this and the last slide. So if either one's on the exam, you could use this as one more fact as part of the meaning of any slide relating to this area that is Central America or Mesoamerica, as it's often called. that area of the world had one of the 5 oldest urban civilizations on Earth. The others you may or may not know, but if you took out 1.1, of course, right, or 2.1, you would probably know, would be Egypt, the other 4, Babylon, China, and India, and then Central America. So that's only 5 parts of the world where urban civilizations existed for over 5,000 years before the dominance of the European colonial invasions. Okay, so it's a pretty major point about the meaning of all the relics or remnants, I should say, of their culture, of the not just the Aztecs, but of course they're latecomers. The earlier ones were way far back. The Mayans predate the Aztecs. You don't have to write this part now, because that's for our 1.1 or 2.1. And then, of course, if you go back far enough, you've got thousands of years ago, earlier urban civilizations in what's now Mexico, Olmecs, Toltecs, and other cultures as well that go back thousands of years, at least 4,000, some say 5, about as far back as the early Egyptians and Chinese, Babylonians, and in the subcontinent of India. They also go back about 5,000 years. Okay, so let's do the formal analysis. This is balanced, except that this temple's taller, so you could make the case it's slightly or somewhat unbalanced toward the left. But the structure, the pyramid, of course, is completely symmetrical, as are all pyramids. So it depends on how you want to emphasize what part of it. So you could definitely say it's technically somewhat or slightly unbalanced toward the right, left to right. But I would say top to bottom. Again, it depends on where you draw the line, but if you draw the line roughly halfway up the pyramid, the wider part here, and then the extra mass of these 2 temples, to me, it balances out top to bottom, but you might think of it more as unbalanced toward the bottom, and that would be fine. The rhythm is very strong here with the stairs, the various ridges, you can call them, right? I mean, levels, if you prefer to say that. Tiers, T-I-E-R, not T-A. EAR, not kind of tier, but the other kind. The levels or tiers are, of course, bounded or have boundaries of projecting stone. So you could say the stone patterns, you want to keep it simple, on the side create rhythm, the stairs. And then these 2 temples are the same basic shape, just one's taller than the other. So there's a lot of rhythm. It's dynamic on the sides, the stairs themselves, of course, and the sloping walls of the temple, but each level is stable. And then the top, the plaza, is stable. And then the 2 temples obviously have diagonal lines. They slope inward, and that makes them more dynamic, I would say, than stable. The textures are only the real textures of stone. Might look like concrete in this drawing. It does, but it's not. They didn't have concrete. The Romans did, but not the Aztecs. But you definitely can see the stonework is smoother only on some of the front of these 2 temples. But mostly it's real rough stone. You can just keep it simple like that. There's no glass here or metal. Okay, and then the color's cool on everything except the outer walls of the taller temple, the one to the right. That's warm, obviously. Reddish brown color. Everything else is cool grays. There's no technique for modeling here, but there is real modeling, of course, as all architecture has, from the shadows created by the sun. In this slide, mostly, of course, on the left side of the structure. And then we have the largest mass. Well, it's the pyramid below, and then it's pretty straightforward. The taller of the 2 temples on top, and then the third largest would be the shorter of those 2 temples. It isn't hollow, but there was space underneath for tunnels, I should say tunnels underneath for storing these skulls of the sacrificed, the dead that were sacrificed, and then what was left at some point after their bodies obviously were separated, they were decapitated. The heads were, just the skulls of it were kept in a. You can go see it now. There's a museum open to it. It's fascinating, open to the public. I mean, but that's underneath the structure. So the actual pyramid was solid, and then these 2 rooms were, in terms of space, they were hollow here. because otherwise, of course, they wouldn't have the room for all these multiple sacrifice, rituals. Okay, then we have line. It's visual, as in all architecture. There's the visual line around the edges formed by the sun, and then also in the borders of the stairs themselves, and at the corners of the two temples. Let's see, balance, rhythm, stable, modeling, texture. Have I covered everything? I think so. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Let's move on to the next slide. This is one that I would say, of all the slides you're going to see today in the first half of this week's topic, the art of the Americas, for those first five we're covering today, is probably the most important one. Can I ask, has anybody here been to this museum? Before you start writing your notes, you take a brief break. I always like to point out things that when you travel, as many of you either already have or will, or as some tourists do in groups, may or may not get the chance if you're on a bus where you have a tour guide that tells you where you're going to go. I hate that kind of traveling, but I understand why many, many people do that the first time they go to a culture that they're not familiar with or don't speak the language. Mi español no es muy bueno, es bastante. It's enough to survive, so it helps to have some little minimal amount, but I studied Spanish for 3 years, I think, at UC Berkeley, and I've traveled to these countries where that is the language. And if you're not in a big city, you're going to have to know how to speak it, at least in the smaller outlying towns and things of Cuba or Mexico. But even if you don't, okay, this museum is called in English, the National Anthropological Museum of Mexico City. Has anyone here been there to that museum? Anybody?
Yep.
Oh, well, yeah. When were you there?
Would have been a couple years after the big earthquake.
Oh my goodness, that far back. I think the museum had just opened then, but was it in a modern building, and then inside all the traditional artwork was there? Because I think they moved it to a newer building, but I'm not sure when.
Yeah, no, I was there when it was a modern building. It was actually really impressive, as modern or more modern than anything we'd have here in the States.
Yes.
And really unexpected when
Yeah.
you are walking around the city of Mexico, which at that time was still pretty damaged. So I was really impressed.
Oh, I am too. Yeah, the architect, darn mine, you don't have to know who he was. He was German, well, German born and educated, but he lived in Mexico. He was 102 or 3 years old when he decided. He lived to be 105. It's an amazing building, but it's not even a building. It's more like a complex with running waterfalls and open plazas and courtyards that are cool, even when it's 110 degrees in the city around you. And it has some beautifully landscaped grounds. I think you might have seen those where you can sit in the cafes, of course, or otherwise just relax and look out at the greenery. But what I really was impressed with, and this is the last thing I'll leave with before we get to the details of the meaning for this slide, is how they displayed their own heritage. It was really well thought out. Each period and culture within the history of Mexico, going all the way back to the earliest urban civilizations, thousands of years, had their own gallery. I think you probably remember that, right? The one who didn't know who it was, just spoke up. And I was impressed with the way they displayed the works. I took a whole 2 rolls of slides when I was there. It was so much to look at. There were whole walls of Aztec temples where frescoes were somehow managed to, well, they've done this in other parts of the world, but I saw several there that I was amazed were undamaged in the process of removing them from those sites where there was maybe construction or something. They couldn't keep the site intact, but they could save the interior. Beautiful colors and details of the Aztec high priests conducting various ceremonies, or even just in their regalia as they were, about to start something. And then there were all these wonderful objects, and this is one of them. And they even had Chihuahuas, different Chihuahua dogs that were highly respected. And of course, that's the part of the world, I guess, that breeds from. We have a half Chihuahua, half Spaniel. We call it Chispaniel, is one of our family pets. Every once in a while, we think she's looking away to her past and the glorious heritage. Oh, it's amazing. Yeah, so if you didn't know about that museum and you're going to go to Mexico City, I would make a whole day at least there. It's easily as interesting as any museum in this country that covers the same topics. I don't mean cultures, but is it a museum of anthropological history, and it goes all the way back from, but then it stops with it doesn't cover the Spanish period. They've got other museums for that. Yeah, it's fascinating. The National Anthropological Museum of Mexico City. Okay, so here we go. That's where this is. So now here's the meaning part. You need to take notes. This is called, the title first, of course, Calendar Stone, just like it sounds, two words, Calendar Stone. And the location is Mexico. It was found in what's now Mexico City, but we just say Mexico. Circa 1500. Again, not the exact year, but this was created before, of course, you can say a couple of decades, or if you want to, you can round it off, say a generation before the Spanish invasion and conquest. And some historians believe that that is part of the meaning of it. But what we do know is the Aztecs believed, first of all, it was found during excavation for, I don't remember what, some construction project. It could have been the same subway lines that they found Templo Mayor during that. But it's about that time in the late 70s. So that's part of the meaning. This was found intact. It's huge. I don't know if the person who was there remembers this piece. You have to look down at it in almost like a well. It's not quite that deep, and it's well lit, so it's much wider than a well where water is drawn up. But it's down below eye level, and it's so well lit that it looks just like that's what this is. The photo from, I assume, the museum's own archives. It's wonderful. So what you have are the various symbols of the beliefs in their various gods. But not all of them, of course, but some of the main ones. And then the cycle, they believe, that is, the Aztecs believe, that their calendar symbolized, this is a calendar, literally a kind of historic document that is, well, today when we think of modern calendars, it's just 1 year, right? And that's it, and then you throw it away. This was meant to symbolize the cycles of their whole history over hundreds of years. So it's symbolic, or it shows evidence of what they believed about their own past, going back over 200 years to the founding of what's now Mexico City, or their capital, Tenochtitlan, in which they believed that there were different periods when their culture would be, let's say, would face some kind of crisis, recover, and it could be a drought, famine, a plague, any of the above, of course. Earthquakes, and in some historians believe that predicting the invasions by a foreign culture and conquest and destruction of their own society is also symbolized here, but I don't know if they can prove that. Anyway, we can say that there are symbols here, for instance, let's go down below, where these fire-breathing and or fire-eating dragons' heads are symbolic of one of their gods of destruction. Now, I'm not about to try and pronounce the names of their gods, and I don't expect you to know that, some of which are summarized or mentioned, in Stockstead. But for this kind of a survey course, it's adequate to just give the broader meanings for these types of symbols. And then this is symbolic of the rays of the sun, these pointed, they almost look like arrowheads, don't they? But that's not what they are. The various rays of the sun, because they did worship the sun, and so this is symbolic of the sun god. Would be, well, I can't say the most powerful deity of all of the deities that they worshipped, but one of the ones to whom they often sacrificed human sacrifices during some of their religious ceremonies. So there's a sun god, which symbolizes a god that you'd think would only be of creation, because no life can exist in our solar system without the sun, right? That's how life on Earth got started, right? But then it did have, of course, the sun itself has some destructive power too. But these are purely forces of destructive power. These two, you can say dragon, some say lizards. I've heard both terms used, but they're more like dragons. Dragons are universal symbols of power and strength of the ruling classes. I think I mentioned that once or twice, but if I didn't, you could add that. And so these are fire-breathing dragons / you could say lizards. One of the most destructive gods that the Aztecs believed in. And then the fine detail here, it's just remarkable. This is about 12 feet across. It's massive, and it must have taken several heavy lifts to move this out of whatever part of the city they found it in underground, buried for hundreds of years. It was in the 1970s, if I recall correctly, and then moved into this exhibit area of the museum. which when you were there, the person, so it must have been just recently opened, I think, because as I recall, it was from the late 80s or early 90s that the museum was constructed and reopened with the new building that's so spectacular and impressive. Okay, so this is one of the most valuable Aztec relics ever found, along with the remnants of Templo Mayor, and it's remarkable that it's intact. And I think it's because it happened to be in an area where sand or some other kind of non what's the word, toxic, yeah, non-chemical, abrasive, right, um, solvent type, water by itself could have destroyed this, but somehow it happened to be buried in an area with this. Some people think it was buried by the Aztecs themselves when they knew they were going to fall to the Spanish. That's a theory, but it kind of makes sense to me. But it's just a theory. I don't think Stocksit even mentions that. But when I was in Mexico City, some of the friends I befriended there who lived in Mexico City told me that's one theory about this, that the reason it's intact and it was found like this without anything missing, look, not even a small piece of it is chipped away or damaged, something, maybe the nose of the sun god, possibly a little bit of deterioration, but that's it, is because it was carefully buried and meant to be, found many centuries later by perhaps Aztec priests as they knew their city was falling to the Spanish invaders. That makes sense to me. And I guess it was found, like you can see it now, almost totally intact. It's a remarkable find. Okay, so let's do a formal analysis here. Oh, I forgot to summarize about the cycles. They believe they had 4 cycles already by the time that this was made in 1500 that had gone through of rising and falling, of prosperity and power, and then calamity, and then they'd start over. So this was then perhaps a warning to them that it'll happen again. And it is true, so you could add this if you want to, that some of the Aztec priests believed that when the Spanish arrived, that they were a fulfillment of one of their prophecies that this calendar and other religious objects had predicted, that the 5th cycle of destruction would be the end of their culture. And that's what the Spanish invasion symbolized. Well, as it turned out, in fact, that is what happened, as we know. I don't know if anybody here saw, this is part of the notes you need to take. We'll do a form analysis in 60 seconds. But if you haven't seen the film Apocalypto, it's not about the Aztecs. I remember thinking that when I first went to see it. I saw it when it first came out because I was already teaching this subject and I'd been to Mexico City by then. Some people say, oh, well, it can't be accurate because it was, the producer was, why am I forgetting his name? The guy from, it'll come to me, the Australian actor. That's terrible. I'm forgetting his name. I can see his face. Anyway, it's true. It was produced by someone who's not of that culture, but all of the research, if you look at that film, if you ever want to watch it, you can get extra credit. That's an option, remember, by summarizing in about 2 pages worth your whatever you thought about, not just the documentary itself. It's called Apocalypto, just like the word apocalypse, but with a YPTO at the end. And it was well researched by indigenous and native Mexican historians at various universities in Mexico.
Were you thinking of Mel Gibson's movie?
Yes, Mel Gibson. Thank you. I was going to get his name soon as I signed it off. Yeah,
and that is based on the fall of the Aztec civilization, right?
Actually, I've had scholars from Mexico tell me it's more about the Mayans because the Spanish arrived on the coast in the last scene. You remember? Don't have to write this, anybody's. But in that last scene, the Spanish ship arriving at the coast could be, of course, the forerunners of, because there were several ships, right? When Cortez invaded, I think he had at least 5 ships. He had only 350 warriors at the start, and then obviously he got some allies among some of the Indians that were enemies of the Aztecs. So I'm not sure. That could be something that you could, for extra credit, include in your 2-page summary if anyone wants to watch it. And I know that's got to be available somewhere, Netflix or Amazon. Apocalypto. Yeah, it was Mel Gibson that produced it, but he did not just rely on some, biased, histories from North American or American or Western or European sources. He went to, I've read articles about this, the research done before the movie was even cast. Oh, it's beautifully, it's really, it's a story of survival and, what can I say, families, managing to overcome things. It's hard to explain. It's on its own, it's a great movie, even if it had nothing to do with the history of what we're covering in this class. So I could even say it's worth watching for that, but you can actually get extra credit if you want to watch it and write a 2-page summary of what you learned about it. Okay, let's do our formal analysis, and then we have, 2 more slides. I'm going to end maybe 5 minutes early today. We'll see. It's balanced, totally symmetrical. That should be really obvious. Every way you look at it, left to right, top to bottom. The rhythm, super powerful with these rays of the sun and the different gods, the heads of different gods, in these squares, I guess they are really patterns. And then, of course, you've got the rhythm of the 2 serpent slash dragons, fire eating dragons at the bottom, and all the geometric patterns are just so wonderfully done. And that's all carved line, of course. That creates, I call it simulated texture on the sun god. Supposedly this god had a face that had some kind of a nose that's missing. Otherwise it's filled with a tongue there. And then these 2, of course, serpent-like or dragons at the bottom have I would call it simulated texture, but the rest of it is just, decorative patterns. Which aren't realistic simulated textures, but it does create texture. The rough texture of the stone is visible through the whole thing. Color, clearly cool. The color is clearly cool here. There's no warm colors. And it wasn't ever painted as far as we know. I mean, maybe, but I've never read that it was. And then we have the largest mass. Well, that's hard to say. I'd say it's a sun god. But if you count these 2 as a single mass, however, they don't really touch, do they? These 2 dragons here at the bottom, fire eating dragons. They could count as the largest mass by a little, but I would say it's the central, the most important element of it is the sun god in the middle. And then you could say it's the squares with the heads of other gods. The jaguar god, I believe, is a jackal god. No, jaguar probably. And then there's the 3rd largest would probably be these sunbursts, rays, I should say, not bursts, the rays of the sun that are symbolized by those pointed details. And then we have the modeling is the shadows from the museum lighting, of course, but it's a bas-relief piece of sculpture. So of course it was intended to have shadows creating part of the design. So there is a technique of modeling for the recessed area behind each figure or each object. But here in this slide, it's the museum lighting that creates that. The line, yeah, there is not really any outline. I already said it's carved line. Let's see. Stable? Well, I don't see much stable about it. Not really. I mean, you could make the case the individual borders between the different recessed objects and then the 4 squares with the heads of some of their other gods. Those are stable, I guess. But even they are kind of at a diagonal when you look at them from, dead on. And then the same is true with the border. I mean, there might be some on the outer border here. Stable quality to the outer edges, but overall the thing is just powerfully dynamic as it's meant to be. And then we have for space, the only techniques are overlapping the heads of these 4 other gods near the middle overlap the background, and then these 2 dragons or serpents at the bottom, and the rays of the sun overlap the background. Let's see, am I forgetting anything? Modeling, texture, space. I already mentioned mass, didn't I? Yeah, I think we've covered it. Okay. This is the next must know, and it's Machu Picchu. M-A-C-H-U, first word. Second word, P-I-C-C-H-U. The location's the country, the modern country of Peru. And I should have put circa, but it's whatever was in Stockstead, 1400s. So some of you know the Inca culture was one of those civilizations that you would have to almost say was, but it wasn't as far back as the ones in Central America. It didn't go back 4,000 or 5,000 years, but it went back at least 1,000 years before the Spanish. So you could just say it was a very old, just keep it simple, a very old or early urban civilization along the Andes Mountains, as most of you know, along some call it the spine of South America. Now, let me ask, because that was one of the only two continents I've never been to. Has anybody here been to South America? Anybody? Yeah, it's somehow, I don't know why, it's far enough away that a lot of people from North America never quite get that far. Further south I've been is near the Guatemalan border in Mexico. Anyway, so this is on the mountain chain called the Andes, of course, is how it's spelled, Andes Mountains, some of the tallest mountains in the world, and certainly the tallest mountain ranges in the Western Hemisphere. And so it's a mountain culture. The people who here are the Incas, and that's capital, if you didn't already know how to spell it, capital INCA. The Incas were an urban civilization that was highly developed. They had several cities, including the capital of Peru now, Cusco, is built, but a little bit different with Mexico City. The Spanish just destroyed everything they could and then built on top of that in terms of destroying the Aztecs, physical remnants. But in Cusco, you can say, which was their capital city, you used to think it wasn't. It was an administrative center and used as maybe a winter capital, part-time, you could say capital city. But the main capital city was what's now, not the largest, one of the largest cities in Peru. I have friends who've been all over this area and shown me their slides. Cusco, you'll have to write that. You can, if you want to know, it's Cuzco, at least that's how I've seen it spelled. Their largest city was the capital, which was further down. It's still pretty high up in altitude, but it's not like this. This is at about 14, well, somewhere around 12,000 feet altitude, nearly over 2 miles. And the air is quite thin. That's why I wondered if anyone's been there, because a few people I know who have say you have to either be in very good health or take your time adjusting to the low oxygen level. And that's an amazing fact, that the city was built at a level, or altitude, I should say, a height or altitude far enough above sea level that it doesn't matter how healthy you are. It's much harder to do physical exertion.
Sorry, I have a question.
Yes, please, go ahead.
Is that the place that you have to like chewy coca, or is that Bolivia?
I've heard that that's one way that sometimes some tour groups have done to adjust, but the other way is to go slowly and take deep breaths. I had that experience in Switzerland, where the Alps get up to about 14 or 15,000. I get slightly lightheaded, but there was a guy with me, he's a World War II veteran, my dad's age. He had to go to the hospital. He literally had altitude sickness, I guess you could call it, or oxygen deprivation. You can have that here. So the fact, in other words, the bottom line here is the fact that this city of about, some people think 15,000, the range is somewhere from 15 to 30,000. Isn't it the whole city? This is just the main part that survived. And this would have been an administrative center for the Aztec rulers. The emperor would have spent time here. Most people think in the winter, because it's so hot down below. From everyone I know who's been, well, I know from being in Central America, in the summer it gets pretty hot in their big cities. So this is a cooler climate, and of course greener, and would have been more, hospitable or comfortable is a good word to use for the ruling. You say the rulers, ruling class, if you want to say that, but I would say just the rulers, the governing people that did all of the administrative work. So it was an administrative center, like a part-time capital, used mostly by the rulers during the summer. Yeah, that's right. I had it right. Because in the winter, of course, it could be snowbound. Yeah, as far as that question about cocoa, I've only heard that. I've not read it, so I'm not sure if that's just apocryphal or anecdotal, that you could do that to get your lungs, and you talk about your body, your lungs, and your brain, your head, feeling, comfortable enough with the low oxygen. But I don't know if that's really done. Probably not by most tour guides, but perhaps some do. In any case, we know you can't just go straight up there from, let's say you get off a plane in Lima, which is down, at a level that's not unusual. It's probably not even as high as Denver. Denver's 5,000 feet. They call it the Mile High City, but you don't get that reaction. I've been to Denver several times. It doesn't affect you. But if you get up around 12,000 feet, yeah, you're looking at 2.5 miles above sea level. it does affect people. So you have to take your time adjusting to it. And I imagine that the Incas did too, while they were building it. And then when they moved here over, whatever period of each year in the summer months. And then it's the architectural construction quality. That is the other main fact about the meaning. Look at this fine stonework. This is called fitted, Fitted. That's an actual architectural term. Fitted stone on the main buildings, which would be temples and administrative headquarters for the different departments. Just like all governments, they have ministers, right? Cabinet members, however you want to call them. I would just use the word ministers, who, supervise different parts of the government functions. It was a well-developed society. It was an urban culture, and they had the fastest communications of any society, something on earth at the time the Spanish invaded. They could get a message within 2 days from the farthest southern reaches of the Andes, where their cities were at the southern edge, which would be Chile, right? Look at a map, how long South America is. One of the longest, if not the longest continent north to south. I think it's longer than Africa. Anyway, it's thousands of miles. So they could go literally thousands of miles from the southern part of the Andes, which is now Chile, all the way into the northern part of Peru, where their northernmost cities were, with runners in 2 or 3 days. You could just say a few days. I mean, it might have been 4, but no way mail traveled that fast from any part of Europe to another part of Europe, let alone across the whole continent. So they had very advanced communication system. Certain documents, of course, were carried by royal couriers who were protected probably to some degree by guards. But then most of it was just, runners who would just take the messages, and perhaps in a belt or some kind, or over their shoulder, or somehow attach it to their body so it didn't interfere with their running. And they could run dozens of miles in a day, of course, with obviously resting in between, and then hand it off to someone else who was rested at the next station. So it's sort of like the Pony Express, only on foot, if you want to look at it that way. I mean, that is, of course, how messages crossed what was then the frontiers of the United States before telegraphs. So they had the fastest communication of any urban civilization in the world during their golden age, which was in the 1400s when this was built. And then the Spanish came in and, of course, took it all over. That was Pizarro, wasn't it? Yes, Pizarro took over, but later than Cortez. It's about a generation later, in the 1540s, and they fought for decades. I think they held out. Some of the Inca cities held out 20 or 30 years after the first Spanish invasion, well into the mid to late 1500s. But eventually, the cities were all conquered. But there are descendants of the Incas still, of course, indigenous people in that part of South America. And this is a sacred site to not just them, but to many people who have a love of history. It's really remarkable. It had terrace gardens. This is still part of the meaning now. And public open plazas where, of course, various religious and other public ceremonies could be held. And then they were able to grow their food on the sides of the mountains. I don't know if anyone's been to, in Vietnam, when I was there, it was fascinating. First flying into the rice paddies on the sides of these hills and things. Of course, sometimes they're in, you think, well, that's all just, ponds, very large ponds where the rice is grown on a level. Most of rice paddies are, but you can grow rice on a hillside. I've seen it. So they grew something like that. I'm not sure if it was really rice, but some kind of grains were grown. And they would have had, of course, farms on the outskirts where, meat and plants, of course, vegetation was grown for consumption. Vegetarian, and they were not vegetarians as far as I know, this culture, but they could grow their own food and were self-sustaining is the point. Within this area, this is where the habitation was. Mostly these were housing and, of course, as they just said, public buildings like ceremonial religious sites and government offices, I guess we call them today, and then mostly residences. And the fact that they're missing the roofs, because the roofs were made out of wood, of course they deteriorated. This place has been abandoned for over 500 years, or about 500 years. But all the stonework almost intact, it survived almost intact. So it's a World Heritage Site, as the UN, of course, designates certain places. There's only a few hundred of those throughout the entire globe, and this is obviously one of the more important ones. Okay, formal analysis, balanced, yeah. I would say if you do this is the section we're talking about, not the mountains behind it. Left to right, absolutely. The rhythm with the terraces, both on the sides of the hills and then outer edges of the plazas. And in each building, many of them, you see these were the houses, and they're just missing the connecting roof beams and, of course, the wooden roofs that once were there. So there's quite a bit of rhythm. There is the dynamic quality of the gables. That's the right word for this. What's left of the roofs of the houses are just the stone gables. Those are dynamic, but most of it's stable, isn't it? It's almost all right angles, and the terracing and the plazas and the larger public buildings. The texture is all real rough texture stone. There's no cement texture, and there's modeling only from the shadows of the sun, of course. And then you have the rhythm, of course, of the repeated shapes of the gables, the walls of the mostly rectangular public buildings, then the terracing. And let's see, then there would be no carved line visible here. So it's just visual lines created by the shadows. And of course, that's the natural modeling from the sunlight. There's no technique for modeling. For space, well, we have different size buildings, including some larger public buildings that could hold, there's a person you can see right there, dozens of people inside. And then the houses would probably each one would be a single family residence, most likely. So maybe, 10 or a dozen perhaps people on average if you had two generations. So the houses were meant for probably single family occupancy, and the public buildings could hold, you could say, scores of people, right? And this one here easily could probably hold over hundreds of various size buildings. There's no technique for space here because it's all the real space. Okay, the color is cool. The stonework is cool. I think that covers, and is it balanced? I would say so. Yeah, if you look at these two sides here in the central plaza. Now we're basically at 4:15. So let's see. I'm thinking maybe we could just do the llama because that won't take too long. This will be only a few minutes. Llama, because it's best to combine the two Inca slides. Llama, two L's, Llama, Bolivia. What's now the country of Bolivia. I think everyone knows how to spell that, right? And this is circa 1400. So they considered the llamas, the Incas, a sacred animal. They used it. Llamas were used for, of course, you could say beast of burden. That almost sounds like a cruel thing, doesn't it? It does to me. They did not abuse them or overwork them. According to everything I've read, they definitely did use llamas to carry, heavy objects, of course, heavier than people could. But they admired them. And the proof of that is in their art. This is silver. Isn't that beautiful? Now, the blanket on the back is more recent, but this is a 600-year-old piece of silver. Look at that. And it's got the personality of a llama. I don't know if anybody ever used to go to the Sonoma County Harvest Festival, was it? That they used to have in the Santa Rosa Fairgrounds. I used to go with my daughter and wife. And there were llama races. I don't know if anybody saw those. I don't know. People raise llamas in this country, of course, but then they were indigenous animals to the Andes. And of course, they were greatly respected, admired, and they were very much useful and helpful to the Inca culture. You could just say it that way. So that's why many objects made out of precious metals, both gold and silver, and even some, I guess, copper, images of llamas were found by the Spanish. And guess what? They melted almost all of them down to make them into coins, but a few survived, and this is one of the few that survived. So that's really the whole meaning of this piece. And of course, we already said who the Incas were. That's part of the rest of the meaning, if this were to be on the final. And that this is a particularly classic example of the fact that they were a highly developed urban culture with, very close knowledge of and living within how you want to say it, the natural world. They respected the natural world around them. Even though they were an urban civilization, they did not usually take abusive advantages of either the landscape or the living creatures around them. It certainly, at least definitely not mammals like this, the llama, the one that they admired the most of all the animals that were indigenous to their area of South America, the Andes Mountains. Okay, formal analysis, it's a cool color, except for the blanket here, which of course is a mixture of right, neutral white and black, diamond patterns, and then the warm red. The line is beautifully done, carved here. Look at that on the nose, the eyes, right, the mouth. And that creates some texture to me, but the real texture is the dominant texture here, of course, of the smooth metal. There's only the modeling from the museum where this is on display. It's balanced. Well, it's an intact, animal. If you draw the line here, left to right, if you were standing in front of this piece or looking straight at it, it would definitely be balanced left to right. And I would say top to bottom, if you draw the line across the middle of the main body, it is stable almost entirely. There's hardly anything dynamic. The tail, I guess, maybe the end of the nose, but even the ears are almost upright, straight upright. I don't think there's a larger and smaller mass unless you want to count the blanket as the second mass. Then, of course, that's the second largest, and the actual animal's body is the largest. Let's see. For space, it's about 4.5 to maybe it's more like 5 inches tall. Yeah, so it's a miniature. Okay, and there is, you could say, overlapping of the blanket, but it's real space. There isn't really any techniques for space. And the line, as I said, is carved line here. Okay, I think we covered all of it. Space. Okay, so yeah, we're ending just about, we started at 3:03, so it's exactly the time we have allotted for the course. But I'm going to stick around now, as usual, as always, I should say, for any questions anybody has about anything we just covered, or about extra credit or grades. Anybody? I'll stick around as long as anyone still needs to ask any kind of questions. Of course, you can always email me, and I will see you all on Wednesday when we finish the Art of the Americas. And I think some of those pieces will be even more relevant to many of you, or familiar, I should even say, because they'll cover parts of what are now the United States and the indigenous cultures in those areas of North America. Okay, again, this is part of this by informal office hour. So if anybody has any kind of questions about extra credit, and if you didn't do your paper, you'd be one of only a handful. I might mention the names of those only as a little prompt to help remind people on Wednesday before we start the slides. That won't take more than 60 seconds at the start of the lecture. But anyway, we're getting down to where it's, now not too many weeks before your second paper's due. And of course you have whatever other extra credit you want to do. Hardly anybody's done any extra credit. So most of you still have up to 60 points anyway. That's your maximum for everybody. If you want to exercise that option and give yourself a cushion or margin for error, that's not a bad idea, but you should probably start doing some of those options soon. Okay, one more time. Anybody have any questions about anything we covered or papers, extra credit, grades? Anybody else? One more time. Okay. All right. Well, then you guys have a good afternoon, and I'll see you all about 3:02 or so on Wednesday. Okay.
Mark.
You're welcome. That's it. All right.
Thanks, Mark. Have a good one.
Yeah, you too. Thanks.